The scorching desert sun beat down mercilessly on the Fort Irwin training grounds as Margaret Maggie Sullivan stepped out of the dusty civilian pickup truck. At 82 years old, her silver hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her weathered hands bore the permanent stains of decades working with grease and metal. She wore simple blue coveralls that had seen better days, with Sullivan stitched across the chest pocket in faded red letters. The sight of her immediately drew snickers from the group of young mechanics surrounding the massive, silent hulk of an M1 Abrams main battle tank. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, barely 28 and cocky with recent technical certifications, nudged his buddy Jackson with his elbow. "Are you kidding me?" Rodriguez muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "They called in someone's grandmother? What you gonna do, knit the engine back together?" The laughter was cruel and immediate. These were the Army's best and brightest technicians, armed with the latest diagnostic equipment, computer systems, and technical manuals. They had spent the last 72 hours trying to resurrect this particular M1 Abrams, tank serial number 23 to 4471, nicknamed Iron Phoenix by its crew. But here's what those young mechanics didn't know, and this is where the Real story begins. The Iron Phoenix had been the pride of the 3rd Armored Division until 3 days ago, when it suddenly died during a critical training exercise. Not just engine failure, complete system shutdown. No power, no hydraulics, no communications. Dead as a stone. But the truly shocking part was yet to come. Colonel Martinez, the base commander, had authorized calling in civilian contractors after his best people hit a wall. The tank's computer systems showed no errors. Every diagnostic test came back green. According to every piece of modern equipment they had, the M1 Abrams should have been running perfectly. Yet there it sat, 68 tons of the world's most advanced battle tank, as useful as a very expensive paperweight. Margaret Sullivan ignored the snickers and walked directly to the tank. She didn't carry a tablet computer or diagnostic scanner. Instead, she had a small, worn leather tool bag that looked older than most of the mechanics watching her. "Ma'am," called out Technical Sergeant Williams, the team leader, trying to maintain some semblance of respect. "We appreciate you coming out, but this is a highly complex digital system. We've run every diagnostic protocol in the manual. The problem isn't something you can fix with traditional methods." His tone was polite, but the condescension was unmistakable. Margaret simply nodded and continued her slow circle around the massive tank. What happened next would shatter everything they thought they knew about modern warfare technology. Rodriguez couldn't contain himself any longer. "Look, lady, no disrespect, but this isn't some old pickup truck with a carburetor problem. This is a $9 million piece of military hardware with more computing power than the space shuttle. You need specialized training, security clearances, and about $10,000 worth of diagnostic equipment just to understand what might be wrong." He gestured dramatically at their setup. Laptops connected to the tank's systems, diagnostic cables snaking everywhere, printed readouts scattered across folding tables. "We've checked every system twice. Power distribution, fire control computers, transmission control modules, hydraulic management systems. Everything tests perfect, but nothing works. It's like the tank just decided to give up." Margaret stopped her inspection and looked up at the young sergeant. Her pale blue eyes held a depth that seemed to see right through his bravado, too. Something deeper. "Son," she said quietly, her voice carrying despite its gentle tone, "I was fixing tanks before you were born. Before your daddy was born, most likely." The mechanics exchanged glances, their smirks widening. Jackson, barely out of technical school, actually laughed out loud. "Right, like when? World War II? Ma'am, with all due respect, tank technology has advanced just a little bit since then. We're talking about fiber optic networks, satellite communication systems, thermal imaging computers. This isn't some mechanical beast you can fix with a wrench and determination." But what Margaret said next stopped their laughter cold. "I didn't fix tanks in World War II, young man," Margaret said, her voice taking on a different quality, one of quiet authority that made the mechs unconsciously straighten up. "I designed them. I was part of the original engineering team that developed the M1 Abrams at Chrysler Defense in the 1970s. The laughter died instantly. Williams blinked, processing what he'd just heard. The M1 program started in 1972. I was 30 years old, fresh out of MIT, with a degree in mechanical engineering and a head full of ideas about how to build the perfect main battle tank. I spent 8 years of my life creating the systems you're standing next to. Rodriguez's face went pale. But that would make you one of the 12 original engineers on the Abrams project. I personally designed the primary power distribution system, the hydraulic management protocols, and yes, even some of the early computer integration systems. She reached into her coveralls and pulled out a faded photograph. It showed a much younger Margaret standing next to a prototype M1, shaking hands with a general. The caption was partially visible. Margaret Sullivan, lead engineer, M1 Abrams Development Team, 1978. And here's what none of your manuals will tell you. Margaret continued, her voice now commanding the complete attention of every person. On that tarmac, every complex system has backdoors, engineering shortcuts, emergency protocols that we built in but never documented officially because the bureaucrats didn't want them in the official specifications. The real shock was about to hit them like a 120mm shell. The mechanics stood frozen as Margaret continued her story, the desert wind the only sound breaking the sudden silence. In 1979, during the final testing phase, we discovered a critical flaw. Under certain extreme conditions, specific combinations of temperature, electrical load, and system stress, the tank would shut down completely to protect its core systems. It was a failsafe we called Phoenix Protocol because the tank would essentially play dead to preserve itself for resurrection. She walked to a specific panel on the side of the tank that none of the mechanics had paid particular attention to. It was small, barely noticeable, and painted over with the same desert camouflage as the rest of the hull. The problem was, once Phoenix Protocol engaged, only someone who knew the exact override sequence could bring the system back online. And since it was never officially documented, Williams found his voice. You're saying this tank isn't broken? It's just sleeping. Like a bear in winter, son. Conserving energy. Waiting for someone who speaks its language. Rodriguez stepped forward, his earlier arrogance replaced by desperate hope tinged with skepticism. If that's true, why didn't the diagnostic systems detect it? We got equipment that can identify problems down to individual circuit boards. Margaret smiled for the first time since arriving. Because your equipment is looking for problems that exist in the manual. Phoenix Protocol was designed to be invisible to standard diagnostics. As far as your computers are concerned, everything is working perfectly, which in a way it is. But the real test was about to begin. Colonel Martinez, who had been watching from his command vehicle, finally approached the group. His face was grim. The training exercise was supposed to resume in 6 hours, and he had a lot of very important people expecting to see America's finest armor in action. Ms. Sullivan, he said formally, I appreciate the history lesson, but I need to know. Can you get my tank operational? Margaret looked at the massive machine, then at the faces of the young mechanics who had been mocking her just minutes before. The weight of decades seemed to settle on her shoulders. Colonel, I can try. But I need to warn you about something. Her voice carried an ominous note that made everyone lean in closer. If I'm wrong about Phoenix Protocol, if this tank has a real mechanical failure and I start manipulating override systems, I could permanently damage $9 million worth of military equipment. The stakes couldn't have been clearer. The mechanics who had been so confident in their diagnosis now realized they were about to witness either a miracle or a catastrophe. So what's it going to be? Rodriguez whispered to Jackson. Genius or disaster? But what happened next would prove that some legends are born from moments exactly like this. Margaret opened her leather tool bag with the reverence of a surgeon preparing for a critical operation. Inside, instead of the primitive tools the mechanics expected, were instruments they didn't recognize, precision devices that looked like they belonged in a laboratory rather than a garage. First things first, she said, pulling out what looked like a modified multimeter. We need to check the baseline power signature, not the normal electrical systems. Those will all read normal. We need to check the phantom circuits. Williams frowned. Phantom circuits? Emergency backup systems that only activate during Phoenix protocol. They draw about 0.3 amps of power continuously, but they're hidden in the normal electrical noise. Your standard equipment can't detect them because they fluctuate randomly to avoid detection. She connected her device to a port that the mechanics hadn't even noticed. A small, unmarked socket hidden behind a maintenance plate. Immediately, her device began displaying readings that made no sense to the watching technicians. Instead of the neat digital displays they were used to, Margaret's equipment showed wave patterns, frequency analyses, and what looked like heartbeat rhythms. There it is, she said with satisfaction. Phoenix protocol is active. The tank is in deep hibernation mode, waiting for the resurrection sequence. But here's where it gets really interesting. She moved to the commander's hatch and began manipulating controls in a sequence that seemed random to the observers. Her fingers moved with muscle memory from decades past, pressing buttons and flipping switches in a pattern that existed nowhere in any manual. The override sequence isn't just button presses, she explained while working. It's a combination of timing, sequence, and this is the part that would have driven the bureaucrats crazy: human intuition. The engineers who designed Phoenix Protocol wanted to make sure only a real person, not a computer or enemy agent, could resurrect a tank. Nothing happened. The tank remained as dead and silent as it had been for 3 days. Margaret frowned and repeated the sequence. Still nothing. Rodriguez couldn't hide his smirk. So much for the legendary engineer. Looks like grandmother's magic touch isn't quite what it used to be. But Margaret wasn't giving up. She stood back and really looked at the tank for the first time, seeing it not as the machine she had helped create 40 years ago, but as it existed today, modified, upgraded, and changed by decades of military service. Of course, she said suddenly. They've upgraded the systems. The Phoenix Protocol is still there, but they've layered new security on top of it. She pulled out her phone, a gesture that surprised everyone. Nobody expected an 82-year-old to be so comfortable with modern technology. I'm calling my old partner, Frank Shin. If anyone knows what modifications they've made to Phoenix Protocol, it's him. The phone conversation was brief and conducted in technical jargon that went over the heads of most listeners. When she hung up, Margaret was smiling. Frank's been consulting with the Army on system upgrades for the past 5 years. Phoenix Protocol is still there, but now it requires biometric confirmation. Williams looked confused. Biometric confirmation? From who? From someone the tank recognizes as an authorized resurrector. The system can identify handprints, voice patterns, even typing rhythms of approved personnel. She walked to the tank's main control panel and placed her weathered hand flat against a section that looked like ordinary armor plating. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, deep within the tank, something stirred. A low hum, barely audible, began to vibrate through the massive machine. "Hello, old girl," Margaret said softly, her voice carrying a note of genuine affection. "It's time to wake up." The transformation was gradual at first. The barely perceptible hum grew stronger, and indicator lights that had been dark for 3 days began to flicker to life. The mechanic stood transfixed as systems they had spent days trying to resurrect began activating on their own. Primary power. Online, Margaret narrated, reading displays that were suddenly showing data. Hydraulic systems, pressurizing. Fire control computer, initializing. Communications array, establishing satellite link. The tank wasn't just starting up. It was coming alive with a thoroughness and precision that made the mechanic's previous efforts look clumsy and incomplete. Rodriguez stared at the displays in amazement. "How is this possible? We checked every one of these systems individually." "You checked them while they were in Phoenix Protocol," Margaret explained. "They were designed to pass diagnostics while remaining completely non-functional. It's like checking if someone is alive by looking at their medical records instead of taking their pulse." The final confirmation came when the massive turbine engine began its startup sequence. The whine of the gas turbine spinning up was music to Margaret's ears, a sound she had heard thousands of times during testing 4 decades ago. Turbine at operating temperature, she announced. All systems nominal. Iron Phoenix is fully operational. The mechanics erupted in cheers, their earlier skepticism completely forgotten in the face of this technological resurrection. But Margaret held up a hand for quiet. "There's something else you need to know about Phoenix Protocol," she said, her expression serious. "It doesn't activate randomly. There are only 3 conditions that trigger it: incoming nuclear attack, catastrophic system failure that threatens crew safety, or—" She paused, looking directly at Colonel Martinez. "Or detection of a specific type of electronic warfare attack designed to take control of the tank's systems remotely." The celebration died as the implications sank in. Colonel Martinez stepped forward, his face grave. "Are you saying someone tried to hack my tank?" "Not just tried, Colonel. They succeeded partially. Phoenix Protocol detected unauthorized access to the fire control systems and shut everything down before the attackers could gain full control." Margaret walked to her diagnostic equipment and pulled up a data log that looked like a computer code waterfall. 3 days ago, at 14:37 hours, someone attempted to infiltrate Iron Phoenix's targeting system. The attack was sophisticated, military-grade. If Phoenix Protocol hadn't activated, someone could have potentially turned your tank's weapons against your own forces. The mechanics exchanged shocked looks. They had been focused on mechanical problems while missing a cyber warfare attack. Williams found his voice. "First, why didn't our security systems detect this?" "Because the attack came through a vector we never anticipated in 1978, Margaret replied. "The maintenance diagnostic port. The hackers probably gained access during routine servicing and planted code that would activate during the next major exercise." Rodriguez, his earlier arrogance completely gone, asked quietly, "What kind of damage could they have done?" Margaret's expression was grim. "In the wrong hands? A single M1 Abrams could destroy an entire forward operating base before anyone realized what was happening. Phoenix Protocol didn't just save this tank. It might have saved lives. But the real question now was, who was behind the attack?" Colonel Martinez immediately called for his intelligence officer while Margaret continued analyzing the attack data. What she found painted a disturbing picture. "The intrusion code has fingerprints," she explained to the gathered crowd. "Specific programming techniques that are like handwriting. Whoever did this has intimate knowledge of M1 systems, probably someone with legitimate access to technical documentation." The investigation that followed revealed a sobering truth. The attack had been part of a wider cyber warfare exercise, but not one authorized by the U.S. military. A foreign intelligence service had been testing the vulnerability of American armor systems, using actual deployed tanks as unknowing test subjects. Iron Phoenix hadn't been the only target. Similar attacks had been attempted on M1 tanks at 3 other bases. But those incidents have been misclassified as routine mechanical failures because no one knew to look for Phoenix Protocol activation. If Margaret hadn't been called in, Colonel Martinez later told his superiors, "We might never have discovered this security breach. We'd still be replacing perfectly good engine parts while our tanks remained vulnerable to remote control." The transformation in how the mechanics treated Margaret was complete. Rodriguez, who had been the most dismissive, approached her as she packed up her tools. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology. A big one. I was completely out of line earlier." Margaret looked at the young sergeant, seeing not the cocky technician who had mocked her, but a soldier genuinely humbled by the experience. "Son, you don't owe me anything. You were doing your job the way you were trained. But maybe now you understand why us old-timers sometimes seem stubborn about doing things the outdated way." She gestured toward the now operational tank. "Modern technology is incredible, but it's built on foundations laid by people who understood that sometimes the old ways exist for good reasons." Williams joined the conversation. "Miss Sullivan, would you be willing to teach us about Phoenix Protocol? And maybe some of the other undocumented systems?" Margaret smiled. "I thought you'd never ask." What followed was unprecedented in military maintenance history. Margaret was brought on as a special consultant, not just for the M1 Abrams program, but for all legacy military systems that might contain undocumented features from their original design teams. She established what became known as the Phoenix Academy, a training program that taught modern technicians to think like the original engineers who designed their equipment. The problem with modern technical education, Margaret explained to her first class of students, is that it teaches you to follow procedures without understanding principles. When you understand why something was built the way it was, you could troubleshoot problems that aren't in any manual. The program was revolutionary. Instead of just learning to replace components, mechanics learned to understand the philosophy behind the engineering. They studied not just what systems did, but why they were designed that way and what the original engineers were thinking. Rodriguez became one of Margaret's most dedicated students. Under her mentorship, he developed an intuitive understanding of tank systems that made him one of the most effective troubleshooters in the Army. She taught me that every machine has a personality, he later explained to new recruits. And just like people, if you want to understand what's wrong with them, you have to listen to what they're trying to tell you. Margaret's success with Iron Phoenix revealed something shocking. Dozens of other impossible equipment failures were actually successful security protocol activations. Foreign intelligence services had been systematically testing American military systems, and the U.S. had been misinterpreting successful defenses as malfunctions. Margaret Sullivan didn't just fix one tank, Colonel Martinez reported to the Pentagon. She uncovered the most significant military cybersecurity breakthrough of the decade. The mechanics who had mocked Margaret became her most passionate advocates. Rodriguez, promoted and humbled, requested to become her permanent assistant. She saved my career and probably my life, he explained. The least I can do is help protect hers. Jackson, who had joked about grandmother's magic, became the most effective recruiter for Margaret's new Phoenix Academy. I thought I knew everything about tanks until I met a grandmother who taught me I didn't know anything at all. 5 years later, Margaret still teaches at the Phoenix Academy. Iron Phoenix serves as the primary training vehicle, where students place their hands on the same controls Margaret used to resurrect the dead tank. Every complex system is a conversation between the engineer who designed it and the technician fixing it, Margaret tells her students. Rodriguez, now Master Sergeant, tells recruits, expertise isn't about age or fancy equipment. It's about understanding, respect, and admitting you might be wrong. Iron Phoenix still serves with the 3rd Armored Division, bearing a plaque, resurrected by MSGT, Margaret Sullivan, Phoenix. Phoenix Academy, 2025. She didn't just fix our tank, Rodriguez reflects. She fixed our thinking, and that's made all the difference. If this story of unexpected heroism moved you, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear about the value of listening to those who came before us, and subscribe for more stories of unsung heroes. Margaret proved that heroes sometimes carry tool bags and the wisdom of decades, ready to teach the next generation